Beyond the Silence. Part 1. Silence, Disclosure, the Hidden Experience. Episode 2. Why Didn't They Tell? Rethinking Disclosure in Domestic Abuse. When domestic abuse is eventually disclosed, one of the most persistent questions is, why didn't they tell someone earlier? It sounds straightforward, but it assumes that disclosure is a single decision made at a particular moment. In reality, disclosure can develop gradually and can be shaped by fear, dependency, uncertainty, previous experiences, relationships, and perceptions of what will happen if the truth becomes known. The question is particularly problematic when it places responsibility for the silence primarily upon the victim. Someone living with domestic abuse may have very good reasons to be uncertain about disclosure. Speaking may affect housing, finances, children, relationships, employment, and personal safety. It may result in intervention, but it may also provoke retaliation from the perpetrator or produce consequences that the individual cannot control. Research supports the complexity of this process. A systematic review examining qualitative studies of people who had experienced domestic violence identified fear of consequences, concerns about safety, fear of judgment, fear of not being believed, lack of privacy, and limited trust in professionals among significant barriers to disclosure. The review also identified trusting relationships, privacy, appropriate questioning, and confidence in the response as important facilitators. This means that disclosure has to be understood within the person's circumstances rather than judged retrospectively. A decision that appears inexplicable from the outside may have been entirely understandable from inside the relationship. If someone believes that telling a professional will immediately trigger actions they do not understand, they may hesitate. If they have children and fear losing them, they may hesitate. If the perpetrator monitors their communications, they may hesitate. If previous attempts to speak have been dismissed, they may hesitate. There is another complication. People do not necessarily recognize domestic abuse immediately. A relationship may begin with behaviors interpreted as affection, concern, or protectiveness. Jealousy may initially be experienced as evidence of love. Financial control may be presented as sensible management. Monitoring may be described as concern. Gradually, however, individual behaviors can form a pattern of restriction and control. Recognition can therefore precede disclosure, but it can also follow it. Someone may first describe an argument, then mention financial restrictions, then disclose threats, and eventually recognize that these experiences formed a wider pattern. The developing account does not automatically establish either truth or deception. It demonstrates that understanding one's own circumstances can change over time. My own experience made me particularly aware that controlling behavior is not always expressed through obvious aggression. My former husband wanted an open marriage, yet simultaneously sought to restrict my independence, including my efforts to gain qualifications. He criticized the notes I made while preparing meals, interfered with activities such as walking and swimming, controlled aspects of my interactions with my sons, destroyed furniture I had owned before we met, and, at times, waited outside the bathroom while I attended to my personal needs. Even clothing I had previously put away would sometimes be placed back out on the bed. When I questioned this, he would move close to me and say, "Spooky things happening." He never physically hit me, but the psychological pressure was relentless. His repeated focus on what he considered to be wrong with me eventually led me to seek help from my GP, who referred me for counseling. I remember the young counselor, with a student observing the session, listening intently before guiding me through a meditation practice that I will return to later in this series. When I eventually said that if he wanted freedom, we should divorce, the response was not acceptance. Instead, threats concerning my home, furniture, and other consequences were used to discourage separation. Looking back, it was the accumulation of behaviors that became significant. My education, activities, possessions, privacy, relationships, and ultimately my ability to leave were all areas in which my autonomy was challenged. This is important when considering disclosure, because someone may struggle to identify one defining incident that explains why they feel controlled. Sometimes it is the accumulation of seemingly separate behaviors that creates the experience of control. The response to disclosure matters enormously. Telling someone is not necessarily the end of the risk. It can mark the beginning of another period of uncertainty. If disclosure is met with disbelief, minimization, or judgment, the individual may learn that speaking does not make them safer. Conversely, being listened to carefully and given clear information can create the conditions for further communication. Professionals therefore need to distinguish between encouraging disclosure and demanding it. Encouragement creates an opportunity to communicate. Demanding a complete and perfectly chronological account can unintentionally reproduce a loss of control. A person does not need to have every detail organized before their concerns can be explored. The question therefore needs to change. Instead of asking, "Why didn't they tell?" we should ask, "What did they believe would happen if they told? What risks were present? Had they tried before? Were they believed? Did they have somewhere private to speak? Did they understand what might happen next?" These questions place disclosure within the reality of the person's circumstances. Silence is not evidence that nothing happened, just as disclosure does not remove the need for careful assessment. What research demonstrates is that disclosure is influenced by relationships, risk, recognition, and anticipated consequences. Perhaps the more useful question is not why someone remained silent, but what conditions would have made speaking possible.